Hey, Jonathan, we've not talked about your career, journalism career yet, but I'm assuming that that can go parallel without causing too much disruption with punting. So has punting been a big part of your life, of your
It
career?
became fun. I always enjoyed anti-post betting rather than sitting down and going through a 0 to 70 handicap, which has never been my thing. I, I, I felt that I was a good enough judge when you see a really smart 2-year-old win or a really smart hurdler win. You think, yeah. And I did very well for a long time backing anti-post. Nowadays on the flat, it's completely different because if you see a nice 2-year-old win and it's trained by Godolphin or John Gosnell or anybody, yes, it's decent, but it might end up going, or Aiden in particular, it could end up going to America instead of running in the Guineas. It could go and run in the Irish Guineas or the French Guineas. So it's very hard to get on because the bookies run, they're terrified now. They're not proper bookmakers. I knew bookmakers when bookmakers. I knew Cyril Steen quite well. I knew Joe Correll, who founded Corrals, and I played snooker with him on a couple of occasions. He would turn in his grave at what Corrals are doing now to punters and other companies like it. It's just embarrassing. It's a joke. They don't lay a bet. They're run by hard-nosed bottom line accountants. And any punter who's any good gets squeezed out. You can't get on with them. Most of my friends either get shut out or closed down. It's an absolute joke. And the real problem is that when I started, which is admittedly a long time ago, you could only bet on greyhound racing or horse racing, and horse racing was about 97% of that. Now you can bet on anything, anywhere in the world. Who's going to be the next prime minister, who's going to do this, who's going to do that. And every year, racing's margin drops. The percentage of money bet on racing, it gets lesser and lesser compared to other sports because everything's 12 months of the year.
Now, you've been friends with some clever people as well, and so I was very interested. Somebody that I used to hear about when I first started back in the very early '90s in the West Country, but I never saw in action, was a guy called Alan Archiband. He's almost disappeared into the mists of time, and you're going to drag him back now because you were friends with him.
Oh, bless him. He and I owned a horse that won at Salisbury one day, trained by David Ellsworth, and we probably should have. She was a real madam. She won on the second start. She was quite well bred. We were offered money for her. We should have sold her, but his wife didn't want to sell her. And of course, she became a bit of a cow, and we ended up selling her for buttons. But no matter, we had a lot of fun with her, ridden by John Williams, who had been a jump jockey and came back to being a flat jockey towards the end of his career. Alan died about 4 years ago, and it was really sad. He was such a good mate. He knew everybody in racing. He knew the jockeys. He knew the trainers. He used to run a tennis tournament down at Bournemouth, the famous Bournemouth Tennis Club, and it was like a who's who racing. John Franken would be there, Toby Balding, Ian Balding, Paul Cole, a few journalists like myself and Colin Mackenzie, and he just knew everybody, and he definitely was getting his card marked by various people. And he was very close to Michael Tabor, and his funeral in Bournemouth, I'd never been to a Jewish funeral before. I found it absolutely fascinating. It was sad, but it was fascinating too. It was like a scene from The Godfather. All these people I knew from racing announced. Harry Redknapp was there. He'd been a pal of Alan's for years. And it was quite extraordinary. It was a lovely service, and I've never forgotten it. It was quite an education for me. And I miss talking to Alan. He worked in the markets. He used to sell cloth and fabrics of very good quality, but he worked Salisbury markets, he worked Newton Abbot markets, Exeter markets. So he would do those markets on race days, you see, and then go off to the races. And he got to know everybody. And when David Ellsworth, even before he got a training license, David trained about 10 minutes from here. He was the assistant trainer to Colonel Ricky Valance, and they were done by the Jockey Club. Whether they stopped the horse or not, I don't really care. But the fact is, they took Valance's license away. So David was unemployed and pretty much unemployable because he was warned off. And he worked with Alan on the markets for 6 months, so they became great mates. So that was another very good contact for him. So Alan used to get on, and he would get good prices, but he was getting his card marked from all over the place. You'd say now that he was, guys were punting to him, and that still happens to this day. Inside information, it keeps the market going, doesn't it? A whiff of scandal is always somewhere in racing.
So he would have been out of the spotlight for a while then.
at the end,
Yeah.
he was out of the spotlight, but he was playing, and he was playing quite big. We would talk most days, and he had an opinion, and he was getting his car marked.
And were there, I mean, especially in your heyday, the betting ring and the racecourses were full of colourful, larger-than-life characters. Were there any others that you've been involved with that?
Well, I knew all the people. As I say, I wasn't a big punter. I just tried to get a value. I wasn't brave enough to be a big punter, take on people like Stephen Little, but he was brave. He was very brave, but very successful for a long time. But now the market's a shadow of what it was. You go racing now, there might only be 10 bookmakers there. There'd be rows and rows of them, and they would all be getting a really good living out of it. In that sense, the game's gone. He's right, Steve Little. The game's gone.
Right. On a more cheerful note, we'll go back to when the game wasn't gone. So back to your beginning. So where did your interest in horse racing stem from?
I used to go to local points. I lived in Dorset. We used to go to local point to points. I loved it. I loved the glamour of it. I loved the. Robert Allner became a great friend. As you know, he trained a Gold Cup winner. I backed his first winner he ever rode in a point to point. It was called Heart of Oak. What a name for a man who had a heart of oak. I had half a crown at 8-1 at the Westmorden point to point. God knows when that was. And we became very good friends. And there was talk about me being a solicitor and then maybe going in the Navy, but that was never going to work because I don't like being told what to do. So I thought quite like to get into racing. I was in the wrong shape to be a rider. So I wrote to several racing journalists saying, how would I get into this? And to my amazement, 4 of them wrote back, sometimes with 2 or 3 pages of writing, encouraging me and giving me advice, which is really extraordinary when you think about it. And I thought, well, I'll have a crack at that. And that's what I did. I went, I worked for Arthur Budget for a year to learn about the practical side of racing. I was a complete dog's body there. I couldn't ride. I couldn't do anything much. I was pretty useless, but I had a great fun year there. And then I got onto a local paper. But while I was with him, he trained a mare called Windmill Girl, who was second in the Oaks while I was there, and who later produced 2 Derby winners, which he bred, Blakeney and Morstan. So I learned an awful lot there. It was quite entertaining because he had won the Lincoln in 1947, long before I was involved, with a horse called Commissar. 58 ran, 58 runners, and it was held at Lincoln in those days. I suppose it was a case of triers to the front and non-triers at the back, but 58, and he told me he had a right touch on that. He was quite wealthy anyway, but that helped him to move to Watcombe, where he trained and where Paul Cole has been so successful since. And while I was there, in the summer of '63 was the Great Train Robbery. And his star apprentice at the time, budget star apprentice, a guy called Chris Caudry, he was a bit of a rascal. And the Grain Train Robbery happened, and about 3 weeks later, his father was arrested in Bournemouth. Roger John Caudry, he was called, with £250,000 in Scottish white fivers on him. He'd paid his rent in advance. They'd scarpered from Leather Slave Farm, where the gang had all hidden after the Great Train Robbery. They scarpered, and anyway, he was caught. And Chris came down to the hospital that morning. He said, they've caught my old man this time. It turned out they'd done a trial run on the Brighton train a couple of years before. Anyway, Roger John Caudry was the man who actually physically stopped the train by putting the filter on the lights. And he went to prison, I think, for 8 years, and he came out, and he was selling flowers at Charing Cross Station. I've never forgotten it.
And you spent the night in a van with a shotgun, I'm assuming not sawn off.
It wasn't sawn off, no. Those were, people don't realise that, but there's a lot of deliberate doping. Doping gangs were doing horses left, right and centre, jumping and flat. There's a famous horse called Pincherischio, trained by Noel Merlis. He was a red-hot favourite for the Derby in 1961, and he was done properly and I don't think he ever ran again. And so Arthur Budget had a really good 2-year-old called Daring Do. He had a bit of an illness during the winter, but he was second or third favourite for the 2,000 guineas. And for the last 2 nights before he went up to Newmarket, I slept outside his box in a Dormerville with a shotgun. And there was nobody, anybody was going to get at him, and I was more terrified probably than anybody who was going to dope him. But there was a very wild, nasty guard dog in the yard. And what I remember most is when Arthur Budget came in the yard the second morning and it attacked him. But yeah, that was quite an experience.
Well, so you then went to work on the racing desk for the Press Association. I mean, that was a bit less exciting, was it?
No, I had. It's very hard to get into. In those days, there were loads of racing journalists, loads of newspapers who employed racing journalists, unlike now. And the only way I could see was to go on a local paper. So I did 3.5 years on a local paper in South London, doing court counsel, murder strikes, football, you name it, everything but racing. The minute I finished my indentures, as they were then called, I went off to Fleet Street to the Press Association, which had been a source of racing journalists going back for many years. A lot of the top racing journalists had started there.
Now, they were based in Fleet Street, not up in Howden.
85 Fleet Street. They were on the same building as Reuters, and they had racing desks all around the country. But within 2 years, I realised that I was waiting to fill in dead men's shoes. They had people in all the good jobs. I was mad keen, and I thought, I'm not going to stay here much longer. If I can find a role, I'll go. That year, The Sun became a new newspaper. It had been called something else before, but they decided to change the name. And their front page lead was a slightly bogus story about a trainer called Roy Pettit, who had allegedly doped some horses. So that was the very first day when the Sun took over from what had been the Daily Herald. And unbeknown to me, the racing correspondent of the News of the World resigned in protest. It was in the same stable. Everybody heard about this and applied for the job. I didn't have a clue, didn't have any contacts. By the time I heard about the job, there'd been about 150 applicants. So I put in an application to be their racing correspondent. And if Betfair had been in play, I'd have been about 500 to 1 and drifting. I didn't know many people, but what I had in my favour was I was young, mad keen, and I was prepared to work very hard, where most of the guys who'd applied for the job wanted a nice sinecure, just do a tipping piece once a week and sit on their bums and go drinking every day.
Those were the days of the legendary liquid lunches, weren't they?
Very definitely. And by some amazing fluke, Frank Butler, the sports editor of the News of the World, gave me the job. It was circumstance. In life, I say I would have been 500 to 1, and I didn't think I had a prayer. But I got the job, and I loved it. And I got to know a lot of people very quickly. I used to go racing, so I'd go back to the office as well. I'd do half a week racing, half a week in the office. Met a lot of people, including a very youthful, unknown jump jockey called Bob Champion. And I can remember taking him round the printing works, showing him on a Saturday night how the paper was printed when it was all hot metal.